The morning Eliza Hartwell was handed to a man who didn't want her, she didn't cry. She picked up her father's signed contract from the table, read every word of it, folded it once, and handed it back without a tremble in her hand. If you love this kind of story, a woman who refuses to break, subscribe to this channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. This is where it begins. The summer of 1818 sat over Hartwell County, Virginia, like something alive and suffocating, pressing down on the tobacco fields and the low wooden storefronts and the red clay roads that wound out past the river toward the Carter land. It was the kind of heat that made men short-tempered and women quietly desperate, and it was exactly the kind of heat in which a life could be decided in the space of a single afternoon without anyone asking the woman at the center of it what she wanted. Eliza Hartwell was 23 years old, and she had learned very early that what she wanted did not carry much weight in rooms where men were talking. She was the eldest daughter of Gerald Hartwell, a man who had spent the better part of 15 years building a merchant business in the county seat, a respectable operation, once before the bad seasons and the bad loans, and the pride that wouldn't let him admit to either. Gerald Hartwell was a man who believed deeply in appearances. He kept his coat pressed and his chin up and his ledgers hidden from anyone who might read the truth written in red ink across every column. Eliza had been reading those ledgers in secret since she was 17. She knew what her father refused to say out loud. She knew that 3 of their 4 properties had liens against them. She knew the mill had been mortgaged twice. She knew the note held against the family warehouse was now in the hands of Nathaniel Carter, and that Carter had every legal right to take it. She just hadn't known until that Tuesday morning in July exactly what her father had offered in exchange for the debt to be forgiven. She found out the way she found out most things, by walking into a room quietly enough that the men inside forgot she was coming. Gerald Hartwell and Nathaniel Carter were standing in the front parlor when Eliza came downstairs. She heard her father's voice first, that careful, controlled tone he used when he was frightened, but performing confidence. "The arrangement is straightforward, Carter. You forgive the note on the warehouse. I provide the union. Both our names benefit." Eliza stopped on the 3rd stair from the bottom. Nathaniel Carter's back was to the door. He was taller than she remembered from the few times she had seen him in town, broad across the shoulders, dressed in a dark coat, despite the heat, his posture carrying the particular stillness of a man who was used to rooms quieting when he entered them. His voice when he answered was low and deliberate. "I don't need your name, Hartwell. I need someone who can manage the household accounts on the eastern property. My steward tells me the books there are a disaster. You've told me your daughter has a head for numbers." "She does," Gerald said quickly, too quickly. "Then we have an agreement." Eliza walked through the doorway. Both men turned. She looked at her father first. Gerald Hartwell had the decency to look away. Then she looked at Nathaniel Carter. He was 40 years old, or close to it. Dark eyes, dark hair gone gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it hadn't softened toward anything in years. He looked at her the way a man looks at a column of figures, assessing, adjusting, moving on. She felt the assessment land, and she let it. Then she walked to the side table, picked up the folded document sitting there, the one her father clearly hadn't expected her to see, and read it from the first line to the last. The room was silent. When she finished, she set it back down. She turned to Nathaniel Carter directly. "You want a wife who can audit your eastern property accounts." He didn't look away. "Among other things." "And in exchange, my father's warehouse note is forgiven." "Correct." "And my 2 younger sisters remain in this house without the threat of being turned out of it." Carter's eyes moved to her father for a fraction of a second, then back to her. "That was discussed, yes." "Then I want it in writing," Eliza said, "not in a separate letter, in this document, before I sign anything." Her father made a sound. "Eliza, Papa." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. If Mr. Carter is a man of his word, he won't object to putting his word on paper. The silence stretched. Nathaniel Carter looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted at the back of his eyes. Not quite surprise. Not quite anything she could name. He turned to the small writing desk in the corner, pulled out the document and added 3 lines in his own hand. Then he held it out to her. She read what he had written, every word of it. Then she signed. The wedding was held 12 days later in the parlor of the Hartwell house because Eliza had refused the church. "There's no reason to make a spectacle of a business arrangement," she told her mother, who had spent the better part of 3 days crying quietly in the kitchen. "It isn't a spectacle," her mother said. "It's a sacrament." "It's a transfer of property," Eliza said. "We don't need an audience for that." The ceremony took 20 minutes. The minister read the words. Eliza said what was required of her and nothing more. Nathaniel Carter said his part in the same steady, uninflected tone he had used in the parlor that Tuesday, the voice of a man completing a transaction. When the minister announced it was done, Carter turned to her without any particular expression and said, "My carriage is outside whenever you're ready." That was all. Eliza hugged her mother for a long time. She knelt down and put both arms around her younger sister Ruth, who was 16 and trying very hard not to cry. She shook her father's hand because she could not bring herself to do more than that, and she held his eyes long enough for him to understand that she knew exactly what he had done. Gerald Hartwell looked like a man standing in the wreckage of something he'd caused. Good, she thought. He should. Then she picked up her single trunk and walked out to the carriage. Carter's eastern property was 3 hours by road, and Nathaniel Carter spent those 3 hours on his horse alongside the carriage rather than inside it with her. Eliza noticed this. She also noticed that he rode without looking back. She used the time to take stock. She was not a woman given to self-pity. She had always considered it one of the less productive emotions, but she was honest with herself, and honesty required acknowledging what had just happened. She had been handed over like a line item on a ledger. She had consented to it, yes. She had negotiated the terms of it. But she had not chosen it, and there was a meaningful difference between choosing something and simply choosing the least terrible version of a thing that was being done to you regardless. She had 4 dresses, 2 books, a sewing case, and $30 of her own money sewn into the lining of her trunk. She had her father's instinct for figures and her mother's instinct for people, and her own instinct developed over 23 years for identifying exactly where power was located in any given room and how to position herself accordingly. She was going to need all of it. The eastern property revealed itself through the carriage window as something that had once been impressive and had been allowed to decline. She could see it in the fencing that needed repair in the outbuildings, that wanted maintenance in the general air of managed neglect, that settled over a property when the person responsible for it was paying attention to other things. But the main house itself was solid, large, built to last. Someone had cared about this place once. She kept that thought and filed it away. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a woman named Agnes Pryor. A stout woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who had held things together through circumstances that would have buckled someone less stubborn. She looked Eliza over with the frank, unhurried appraisal of a woman who was trying to determine how much trouble the new arrival was going to cause. Eliza met her gaze steadily. "You're younger than I expected," Agnes said finally. "Most people are surprised by that," Eliza said. "I find it useful." Something flickered in Agnes's expression. "Mr. Carter says you'll want to see the household accounts." "As soon as I've had a chance to set down my things. They're in the study. I'll warn you they're not pleasant reading." "I've never found account books pleasant," Eliza said. "I've only found them useful." Agnes almost smiled. "Come inside then, Mrs. Carter." It was the first time anyone had called her that. Eliza followed the woman through the front door and didn't let herself think too hard about what it meant. She had the household accounts spread across the study table by 6 o'clock that evening. Agnes had been right. They were not pleasant. The eastern property ran 2 separate operations, a working farm with livestock and grain fields, and a small secondary mill that processed timber for the surrounding county. Both were profitable on paper. In practice, both were hemorrhaging money through inefficiency mismanagement, and what appeared to be at least one case of systematic pilfering by someone who had been careful, but not quite careful enough. Eliza set that last file aside and kept working. She didn't hear Nathaniel Carter come in. She became aware of him when she reached for a candle to light against the failing evening and found him standing in the doorway watching her. "The study is usually locked," he said. "Agnes gave me the key." "Agnes doesn't give that key to anyone. She gave it to me." Eliza turned back to the ledger. "Your timber receipts for April and May have been entered twice. The second entry is slightly lower in each case, and the difference accumulates to approximately $43 over the quarter. Someone has been skimming." Silence. "Who has access to these books?" she asked. "My steward, Jed Atkins." "How long has he been in that role?" 4 years. "Then the problem goes back at least 4 years. Possibly longer if he learned to be more careful over time." She looked up at him. "You'll want to discharge him before he realizes I've found it." Carter's expression was unreadable. "You found that in 3 hours." "It wasn't difficult once I knew where to look." She held his gaze. "I told you I had a head for numbers. You could have simply taken my word for it." "I didn't take your word for anything," he said. "I took your father's." The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Eliza held them. "Then I suppose," she said carefully, "you'll want to form your own opinion." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and left the room without another word. Go. The first week at the Eastern property was an education in the particular texture of Nathaniel Carter's isolation. He was not cruel. She had braced herself for cruelty, for coldness deployed as punishment for the kind of deliberate disregard that some men used as a weapon, but that was not what she found. He was something more complicated than cruel. He was gone. Not physically absent, she saw him at breakfast, saw him crossing the yard toward the barn, heard his voice through walls conducting business with the men who worked the farm, but absent in some other harder-to-name way. Like a man who had learned to be in a room without actually inhabiting it. She learned his patterns by watching, which was something she had always been good at. He woke before dawn and worked until dark. He ate his meals quickly and without pleasure. He gave instructions with precision and no elaboration. He had no particular friends among the county's other landowners. She learned this from Agnes, who offered information in small, careful quantities, testing her. He had no social engagements. He received no personal correspondence, only business letters, which he answered within 24 hours. He had been married before. Agnes told her this on the 4th day, in the same careful tone she used for everything, offering the fact neutrally, watching Eliza's face. "Her name was Catherine," Agnes said. "She died 6 years ago. Fever. They'd been married 3 years. Eliza didn't ask anything else, and Agnes didn't volunteer anything else. But it settled something into place, the way a key settles into a lock, not opening anything, just clarifying the shape of what was in front of her. A man who had built walls was different from a man who had simply been born without warmth. One was damage. The other was character. And damage, in Eliza's experience, was something that could sometimes be worked around, given enough patience and enough honesty. Character was considerably harder. On the 9th day, she walked out to the far fields. She had gone through the accounts twice by then, prepared a full report on the Atkins problem, and 2 separate recommendations for operational changes that would reduce costs by a measurable amount, and spent the remaining hours learning the property. She had met most of the workers, learned their names, learned which ones had families in the cabins at the south end of the property, learned which of the children had been sick last winter, and which of the older men had a bad knee that slowed him down in the mornings. What she found in the far fields stopped her. There were 6 families living in the farm workers' cabins at the southern boundary, and the condition of those cabins was a scandal. Roofs that leaked, floors that had rotted through in places, a well that had gone brackish, children who were thin in a way that had nothing to do with summer heat, and everything to do with not enough food consistently enough. She stood in front of the cabin nearest the fence and looked at it for a long time. Then she turned around and walked back to the main house. She found Carter in the barn. "Did you know," she said, not raising her voice, "that the families in the south cabins have been using a contaminated well?" He looked up from what he was doing. The south well was reported as repaired last fall. It wasn't repaired. It was patched. There's a difference. The patch failed sometime in the winter, and no one told you, or no one you trusted told you, which amounts to the same problem. She crossed her arms. "Those children are drinking bad water, Mr. Carter. One of them is sick right now. I think it's been going on long enough that they've stopped expecting it to change. I'll send someone to look at the well. The well needs to be replaced entirely, not looked at. And the roofs on at least 3 of those cabins need real repair, not more patching. And the family food allotments are short by approximately 1/3 of what was promised in the work agreements." She paused. "I found the original agreements in the study. Someone changed the numbers on the copies held at the property." Carter had gone very still. "Atkins again," he said. "Almost certainly. He's been taking money in 3 different directions at once. He's been at it longer than 4 years. The altered agreements predate his stewardship, which suggests he found a system someone else started and improved upon it." She met his eyes. "You've been robbed, Mr. Carter, and the people working your land have been the ones suffering for it." He said nothing. "I can document all of it," she said. "If you want to pursue legal remedy, I can give you a record that will hold up. But in the meantime, those families need clean water and adequate food and repairs that will actually hold. Those things need to happen now, not after the legal situation is resolved." "You've been here 9 days," he said. "Yes. And you've found all of this in 9 days. I've been paying attention." She held his gaze without apology. "It wasn't difficult, Mr. Carter. It only required someone to actually look." The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest. She had learned to prefer honest silences to comfortable lies. He looked at her for a long moment, the same long assessing look he had given her the day they met in her father's parlor, the day she had read the contract and handed it back and refused to be reduced to a line item without at least writing her own terms into the margin. Then he said, "Write up what you need for the well and the cabins. I'll authorize the costs." She nodded. "And Mrs. Carter," he said. She turned back. "The report on Atkins, when you have it finished. By the end of the week," she said. "I'll need it by Thursday." "Then by Thursday," she said. And she walked out of the barn and back toward the house, and she did not let herself think about the way his voice had changed very slightly between the first word and the last. Not warmer exactly, but different. Like a door that was still closed but had shifted almost imperceptibly on its hinges. She didn't let herself think about it. She had too much work to do. The day Jed Atkins was discharged, he made the mistake of confronting Eliza in the front yard. She had seen it coming. Men like Atkins' men who had run their deceptions for years with confidence had a particular way of reacting when the ground shifted under them. They looked for the weakest point to push against, and in the calculus of 1818, Virginia, a young woman who had arrived as a debt settlement, was the obvious choice. He came at her in the late afternoon, after Carter had given him his notice, and the accounting documents had been handed over to the county magistrate's office. His face was red. His voice was loud. He used several words that Eliza's mother would have been horrified to hear a lady stand still for. Eliza stood still for them. When he was finished, she looked at him calmly. "You've stolen from this property for the better part of 6 years," she said. "You've underfed families with children. You've falsified legal documents. Those are not the actions of a man whose anger I'm willing to take seriously." She tilted her head slightly. "If you want to argue about the mathematics, I'm happy to go through the ledgers with you one more time. But if you're here to shout, you should know I've heard better." Atkins stared at her. "Get off this property," she said, still in the same even voice, "before Mr. Carter comes back out." He left. Agnes, who had watched from the porch, waited until the man was through the gate and down the road before she spoke. "Where'd you learn to do that?" she asked. Do what? Stand there like that. Like nothing he said could touch you. Eliza thought about it for a moment. My father had business partners for 30 years, she said. I spent a long time in rooms where men were louder than they were right. You learn to sort out the difference. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're going to be all right here, Mrs. Carter. It was the most warmth Agnes had offered her since she arrived. Eliza found, to her own surprise, that it meant something. Nathaniel Carter watched his wife more closely after the Atkins business. He didn't think about it as watching. He thought of it as reassessing which felt more appropriate for a man who had built his entire life around controlled conclusions and measured responses, and the principle that emotion was a liability that careful men learned to set aside. He had been careful. He had been very careful for 6 years since Catherine died and left him alone in a house that suddenly had too much space in it and too much silence and too many rooms he had stopped going into because going into them meant remembering what they had held. The arrangement with Hartwell had been logical. He needed someone to manage the Eastern property. Hartwell's daughter was reportedly capable. The debt clearance resolved a business problem cleanly. It was not about anything other than practical necessity, and he had been very clear with himself about that. But the woman who had walked into her father's parlor and read a contract before agreeing to sign it, the woman who had found $43 in skimming within 3 hours, and a 6-year theft operation within 9 days, and stood in front of a man twice her size in his own yard, and told him to get off the property, in a voice that didn't shake once she was not what he had arranged for. He didn't know what she was. He sat with that uncertainty, the way he sat with most things that discomforted him at a distance behind a wall, letting it settle without approaching it too closely. But he watched. He watched the workers' wives begin nodding to her when she crossed the yard. He watched the children cautious at first, because they were always cautious around people from the main house, slowly warm to her, following her at a distance, then less of a distance, then crowding around her when she brought out paper and pencils to run the informal lessons she had started 3 mornings a week in the space behind the repaired cabins. He hadn't asked her to do that. She hadn't told him she was going to. He found out because one of the farmhands mentioned it in passing, and then he had stood at the edge of the south yard on a Thursday morning and watched his wife sit on an overturned crate in the summer heat and teach 4 children and 2 of their mothers how to read a measuring stick. He hadn't been seen. He had been very careful not to be seen. On the evening of the 17th day, Eliza came to find him. He was in the small room he used for his private accounts, the one with the narrow window that looked out over the east field. She knocked twice, waited, and came in when he said nothing. She set a folder on the table in front of him. The completed Atkins report, she said. Everything is documented and cross-referenced. The magistrate's office will want pages 14 through 22. Specifically, those have the altered work agreements side by side with the originals. The rest is supplementary. He looked at the folder. He did not open it. There's a second section at the back, she said. Those are my recommendations for the property over the next 12 months. Operational changes, maintenance priorities, the cost projections for the new well and the cabin work. I've also outlined a revised food allotment structure for the workers. It's still within reasonable operating costs, and it's closer to what was actually promised them. You didn't have to include that last part, he said. I know. She met his eyes. I included it anyway. He looked at her, that same long, quiet look that she had started to know as his way of processing something he hadn't expected. Why? He said. She considered the question. Because they're your workers, she said. And they've been treated unfairly under your name. That's a debt of a different kind. It should be corrected, and since I'm the one who found it, it seemed logical that I should be the one to tell you how. He said nothing for a moment. Then, sit down, Mrs. Carter. She sat in the chair across from him. Why did you agree to this marriage? He said, not unkindly, directly. She looked at him steadily. To protect my sisters. Not your father. My father made his choices, she said. He's living with them. My sisters had nothing to do with any of it. A pause. Why did you agree to it? He seemed slightly surprised to be asked. Your father had something I wanted to resolve cleanly, he said. And I needed someone for this property. Both problems with one arrangement. And you expected someone you could put in a corner, she said. Not with anger. With the same directness. He almost said something. She watched the thought move through his face and be set aside. I expected someone manageable, he said finally. I'm afraid you were misinformed, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Not quite nothing. Yes, he said. I'm beginning to understand that. The room was quiet. Outside, the evening had settled into the long golden hold of a Virginia summer dusk, and somewhere down the road, a bird was running through the same 5 notes over and over, with the patience of something that had never expected an answer. Eliza rose to leave. Mrs. Carter, he said. She turned. He picked up the folder. This is good work. She nodded once. I know, she said. She closed the door behind her. For the first time in 6 years, Nathaniel Carter sat alone in a quiet room and found himself thinking about something other than the work in front of him. He thought about a woman who had walked into a contract negotiation and demanded her terms in writing. He thought about a voice that didn't waver in front of a man twice her size. He thought about gray-blue eyes that didn't look away. He sat with it for a long time. Then he opened the folder and began to read. The folder was on his desk the next morning, and he had marked 7 pages. Eliza found out because Agnes told her with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting years to see someone put something on Nathaniel Carter's desk that he actually read past the first paragraph. He was in that room until past midnight, Agnes said, pouring coffee with studied indifference. Came out for a candle around 10, didn't say a word to me, went back in. Light was still under the door when I checked at 11:30. Eliza drank her coffee and said nothing. He marked 7 pages, Agnes added. You counted. I have eyes. Eliza set down her cup. What does he usually do when he reads reports? Signs them or burns them, Agnes said. He doesn't mark pages. That man has never marked a page in the 4 years I've known him. She carried that information with her into the morning and did not let it show on her face. She had work to do. She always had work to do. That was, she had discovered the best thing about being useful. It gave you somewhere to put yourself, when thinking too carefully about a situation would only complicate it. The new well construction had begun the day before. She had negotiated the labor cost herself with a man from town named Caleb Marsh, who had come recommended by 2 of the farmhands, and who had the useful quality of saying exactly what something would cost, without adding 20%, for the difficulty of dealing with a woman who knew what things cost. She liked Caleb Marsh considerably for that. She was out at the south cabins, reviewing the timber order for the roof repairs, when Carter came to find her. She heard him before she saw him, his boots on the dry ground, the particular cadence of a man who walked like he owned the land, because he did, and had for long enough that the ownership had gotten into the way he moved. She didn't turn around. The magistrate's office sent a writer this morning, he said, coming to stand beside her. They want to move forward on the Atkins matter. The county solicitor says the documentation is among the cleanest he's seen. Good. She handed the timber estimate back to Caleb Marsh and told him she'd have an answer by noon. Marsh tipped his hat and made himself scarce with the efficiency of a man who had correctly read the room. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that whoever prepared this clearly understood that a case like this lives or dies on the precision of its numbers. Carter paused. He asked who your people were. I beg your pardon? Your family, your training. He assumed you'd had formal instruction somewhere. I taught myself, she said. My father kept his books in a drawer he thought was locked. I found the key when I was 14. She glanced at him. He thought I was in the parlor learning needlework. Something shifted in Carter's expression. And were you? I was terrible at needlework, she said. The books were more interesting. He was quiet for a moment. "The 7 pages you marked," she said. "Was there something incorrect?" "No." He looked at her. "I marked them because I wanted to come back to them." "Why?" "Because they were well-reasoned." He said it plainly without the particular stiffness she had noticed he used when he was forcing himself to say something that didn't come easily. "I wanted to understand how you'd arrived at those conclusions." "You could have asked me." "I know." "Instead, you stayed up past midnight with a candle." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "That seems like a less efficient approach, Mr. Carter." "It is," he said. "I'm reconsidering my methods." She didn't smile. She came very close to it. "The recommendations in the back section," he said. "The operational changes. I want to go through them with you." "When?" "This afternoon. After you've finished with the cabins." She nodded. 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock. He confirmed, and he walked back toward the main house, and she turned back to her work, and she was absolutely certain that she had almost smiled. She made certain she didn't do it again. The meeting at 3 o'clock ran until 6. Not because the recommendations were complicated, though some of them were. Because Carter asked questions, careful, specific, sometimes unexpected questions, that pushed into the logic of what she had written, and required her to defend her reasoning, or twice acknowledge where her reasoning had a gap that she hadn't seen. She acknowledged the gaps without apology and without embarrassment. A gap in reasoning was a problem to be corrected, not a failure to hide. Carter noticed this. She could see him noticing it in the way his questions shifted over the first hour testing at first, then genuinely curious, then something else she didn't have a name for, yet something that sat between respect and recalibration. "The grain rotation you're proposing," he said at some point past 5 o'clock, "that's not standard for this county." "No, it's what they've been using in the Pennsylvania operations for the past decade. The yield improvement is documented." She pushed a page across the table. "I wrote to a man I know in Philadelphia last week, and he sent me his family's numbers from the last 3 seasons." Carter looked at the page. "You wrote to Philadelphia?" "I needed data. Last week." He looked up. "You'd been here 11 days." "I wanted to be thorough." She met his eyes. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said slowly. "It isn't." He looked back at the numbers. She watched his face, the face of a man who was working through something that didn't fit the shape of what he'd expected, like trying to pour water into a container that hadn't been built to hold it, and finding to his confusion that it held anyway. "You know what this property needs," he said finally. "Not a question." "I know what the numbers say it needs," she corrected. "You know this land. You know the people and the seasons, and what this county will and won't support. The numbers are useful, but they don't replace that knowledge." She paused. "Which is why I was hoping to go through this with you, rather than simply hand it over and let you implement it without the reasoning behind it." He set the page down. "Why?" "Because otherwise you'd be trusting my conclusions without understanding them," she said. "And you've made it fairly clear you don't trust conclusions you haven't verified yourself." A long pause. "That's an accurate characterization," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been paying attention." Something happened in the room then. Not dramatic. Not anything she could point to. Just a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air between them, like the moment when a room that has been holding its breath finally slowly lets it go. Carter leaned back in his chair. "What else have you been paying attention to?" he said. She considered that for a moment. "You eat breakfast alone," she said. "You take your coffee without milk. You check the east field before you check anything else in the morning. You never ride the same route twice in a row. You answer your business correspondence within a day, but you have a stack of personal letters in the bottom drawer of this desk. I can see the edge of them from here that are months old and unopened." She paused. "You don't like being caught off guard, and you've been caught off guard more than once in the past 2 weeks, and you're not entirely sure what to do about that." The silence stretched. "That's a great deal of attention," he said carefully. "I told you," she said. "I've always been better at watching than being watched." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with that long, quiet look, the one she had stopped trying to interpret, because she had a feeling it was still changing, still becoming something it hadn't been at the start, and it was too early to try to name something that was still in motion. "The personal letters," he said at last. "I'm sorry. That was too far." "No." He said it firmly. "You're right about them." A pause. "They're from my wife's family. Her mother. Her two sisters. They've written every few months since Catherine died." Eliza said nothing. "I haven't known what to say to them," he said. "So I haven't said anything." For 6 years. For 6 years. She understood then something she hadn't fully understood before, not just about the unopened letters, but about all of it. The empty rooms, the meals taken alone, the way he stood in doorways without quite entering. He had built a life that looked like discipline and felt to him like safety. He had made himself so efficient, so self-contained, so relentlessly purposeful that there was no space left for anything to get in and hurt him the way Catherine's death had. It wasn't coldness. It was scar tissue. She had been wrong about the shape of it. She hadn't been wrong about the damage. "You don't have to say everything," she said quietly. "You could write one letter. Tell her mother that you received her letters and that you're grateful. That's enough to start." He was quiet for a long time. "You make it sound simple," he said. "Most things that feel impossible are actually just things we haven't started yet," she said. "The starting is what's hard. After that, it's just the next word." He looked at her. And then he did something she had not seen him do once in the 19 days she had been in this house. He looked tired, not in his body, in his face, in the part of a face that shows what a person is carrying when they finally stop holding it at arm's length. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Yes. What do you want from this marriage?" She had not expected the question. Not tonight, not in this room at this hour, with the evening pressing against the windows and the account books spread between them like a shared language they were both still learning. She thought about it honestly. "I want to be treated as a person with judgment worth listening to," she said. "I want to do work that matters. I want my sisters to be safe." She paused. "And I'd like, if it's possible, not to spend the rest of my life sitting across from a man who wishes I wasn't there." "I don't wish you weren't there," he said. It came out quickly, more quickly than she thought he'd intended. "Then we're making progress," she said. She gathered her papers. She rose. She was at the door when he spoke again. "Eliza." It was the first time he had used her name. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for the report, for all of it." She stood with the weight of it for a moment. "You're welcome, Mr. Carter," she said, and she went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she was very honest with herself about the fact that something had shifted tonight, quietly, carefully, without either of them reaching for it, and that she did not yet know what to do with that. She decided she didn't have to know yet. She had work to do tomorrow. Word spread through a small community, the way water moved through dry ground, faster than you'd expect, deeper than you'd plan for, following paths that no one mapped in advance. By the beginning of August, 3 weeks after Eliza's arrival at the Eastern property, the county knew that Carter's new wife had cleaned out a 6-year theft and replaced the south well, and started morning lessons for the workers' children, all inside the span of a month. The way the county chose to discuss this information fell roughly into 2 camps. The first camp found it interesting. The second camp found it threatening and therefore preferable to talk about as a problem. She met the second camp on the first Saturday of August at the county trading post in town, which she had gone to alone because she needed linen and timber measurements, and Carter was meeting with his solicitor about the Atkins matter. She had Agnes's wagon and Agnes's recommendation of a woman named Mrs. Delacroix, who ran the dry goods portion of the trading post and kept honest prices. She found Mrs. Delacroix, who was indeed honest in her prices and brisk in her manner, and seemed inclined to treat Eliza as a straightforward transaction, rather than a spectacle which Eliza appreciated. She was settling the linen order when the other women arrived. There were 3 of them. She placed them by accent and dress as wives of established county landowners, not the wealthiest tier, but comfortable, which in her experience was often worse, because people with enough to feel secure were more inclined to defend it with their opinions about other people's choices. The one who spoke first was a Mrs. Eleanor Stokes. Eliza knew the name. The Stokes owned land adjoining the eastern property's northern boundary. "Mrs. Carter." Mrs. Stokes said it pleasantly enough. "I don't believe we've met properly." "We haven't," Eliza said. She finished her transaction with Mrs. Delacroix and turned. Mrs. Stokes had a smile that worked entirely in the top half of her face. "Gerald Hartwell's daughter," she said, as if confirming something she'd suspected. "We knew your father when he was well. He was a well-regarded man once." "He was," Eliza said pleasantly. "It must be quite a change." Mrs. Stokes continued, "Coming from a merchant family to the Carter property. Nathaniel runs a serious operation. I hope you haven't found it overwhelming." "I've been managing the property accounts," Eliza said. "It's kept me busy." Something moved across Mrs. Stokes's face. Not surprise, something more deliberate. "How ambitious of you." She turned to her companions with the particular ease of a woman who had an audience and knew how to use it. "The Carter land is substantial, of course, but Nathaniel has always been private. I do hope the arrangement suits you. Some men need a particular kind of wife. Patient, undemanding." She smiled again. "Not everyone is made for that kind of marriage." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "You're right," she said. "Not everyone is. It does require a woman who's comfortable working without constant reassurance." She began gathering her parcels from the counter. "I find I manage it reasonably well. Good afternoon, Mrs. Stokes." She was almost at the door when Mrs. Stokes spoke again, a little louder to the room. "Of course it's all very well to manage accounts, but a man like Carter needs more than a ledger keeper in his house. Some women come into a marriage with a purpose and find they've misread what the purpose actually was." Eliza stopped. She turned around slowly. The trading post had gone quiet in the particular way of a space where people are pretending not to listen. She walked back to the counter. She set her parcels down. She looked at Mrs. Stokes with complete, clear-eyed calm. "Mrs. Stokes," she said, "I've been in this county for 3 weeks. In that time I've recovered approximately 6 years of stolen income from a fraudulent steward, improved the operational efficiency of the eastern property by a documented margin, and ensured that the families working that land have clean water and roofs that don't leak before the winter comes." She paused. "I understand your concern about what kind of wife Nathaniel Carter needs. But I'd invite you to consider whether the woman you're describing, patient, undemanding, comfortable being managed, would have managed any of that." Dead silence. "I'm not patient," Eliza continued conversationally. "I'm thorough. There's a difference. And I am not undemanding. I demand accuracy, fair treatment, and that people be told the truth about what they've earned." She picked up her parcels. "Now, is there anything else about my marriage you'd like to discuss? Or shall we save it for a day when I have more time?" Mrs. Stokes had gone a particular shade of crimson. Nobody in the room said anything. Eliza walked out. She was 3 steps from the wagon when she heard boots behind her, quick, unhesitating, and a voice she didn't recognize said, "Mrs. Carter." She turned. A man she'd never seen before, lean-weathered, maybe 50, with the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors, was standing behind her. He held his hat in both hands. "I work the marsh farm north of here," he said. "I knew your husband's first wife, Catherine." He paused. "She was a good woman. Fought hard to help people on that property too before she got sick." He looked at Eliza steadily. "I just wanted to say what you've done for those families on the south end, with the water and the cabins. Mrs. Catherine would have been grateful to know someone was doing that." Eliza held his gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am?" He put his hat back on, nodded once, and walked away. She stood beside the wagon for a moment without moving. Catherine would have been grateful. She turned that over in her mind all the way home. Not with jealousy, which was too simple an emotion for what she was feeling, but with something more complicated. A sense of shape. A sense that the house she was living in had been loved before and lost before, and that the walls of it held that loss, the way old wood held water, deep and silent and always present just beneath the surface. She hadn't been replacing anything. She had been trying to build something entirely new in a place that didn't know yet whether it was ready to hold something new. She wasn't sure that made it harder, but it made it real in a way it hadn't quite been before. She told Carter about the exchange in the trading post. Not all of it. The part about Mrs. Stokes she kept to herself because it wasn't his problem to carry, and because she had handled it herself and did not require him to manage her social battles. But the man with the hat that she told him that same evening over the supper table, because she thought he should know, and because she had decided somewhere between the trading post and home that honesty between them was going to have to be the foundation of whatever this was. Because they hadn't started with love, and they hadn't started with choice. And those were two of the things most marriages were built on, and they were going to have to build with different materials. Carter went very still when she told him. Orson Webb, he said. That would be Orson Webb. He worked the Marsh property for 20 years. He said he knew Catherine. He did. A pause. Most people in this county knew her. She made herself known to people. She didn't wait to be introduced. She went and found people. What was she like? Eliza asked. She wasn't sure she intended to ask it. The question came out before she'd decided to say it. Carter was quiet for a long moment. Not in pain exactly, or not only pain. In the way of a man choosing how much of something to carry into a room. She laughed too easily, he said at last. She trusted people before she'd earned reason to. She argued with me constantly about money I spent on things she thought were unnecessary. Something in his voice changed warm, and then, not like a match lighting and going out. She used to leave the doors open in summer. Every door in the house. I'd close them, and she'd open them again, and she'd say, a house with closed doors in summer was a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Eliza thought about the doors she had noticed, the ones that stayed shut, even in the heat, in every room of the main house. She sounds like someone who was difficult to lose, she said. Yes. The word was barely a word. More like a sound. She was. The silence between them was different from the others. Not uncomfortable, not measured. The kind of silence that happens when two people have just let something real into the room between them and are both deciding whether to acknowledge it or pretend it wasn't there. Eliza made her decision. I'm not trying to be her, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not here to fill a space she left. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it would be honest to try. He looked at her across the table. I know that, he said. I just want to be sure it's been said. It has. He held her gaze. Clearly. She nodded. She looked down at her plate. She picked up her fork. She was right about the doors, she said after a moment. The east wing is half a degree warmer than the rest of the house because you keep them shut. A pause. I'm aware, he said very carefully. I'm going to open them tomorrow, she said. For the cross draft. Another pause. That's reasonable, he said. I know, she said. And they finished supper without speaking again, and it was the most comfortable silence they had had yet, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It came addressed to Nathaniel Carter from Philadelphia, and the handwriting on the outside was a woman's careful, old-fashioned, slightly uneven in the way of someone whose hands had begun to give her trouble. Eliza saw it on the hall table when she came in from the south cabins, recognized the deliberateness of it even before she picked it up and set it aside from the rest of the correspondence with the envelope face up. Carter came in at noon. She watched him see it from across the room. He went still. It's from Catherine's mother, she said quietly. He didn't answer. I didn't open it, she said. But if you'd like to read it later, the study will be empty after 2 o'clock. He picked it up. He stood with it in his hand for a moment, that specific stillness. He had the one that looked like discipline from the outside, and she had come to understand was something considerably more fragile. Then he walked into the study and closed the door. He didn't come out for 2 hours. When he did, his face was the face of a man who had put himself back together carefully after something had come apart and was carrying the seam lines where he'd done the repair. Eliza was at the hall table working through the week's supply receipts. "She doesn't blame me," he said. She looked up. Catherine's mother. He stood in the doorway. "She says Catherine would have hated knowing I'd shut everyone out." He paused. "She says she's been writing because she didn't want me to be alone in the silence." Eliza set her pen down. "Will you write back?" she asked. "Yes." He looked at the letter in his hand. "I think I will." He looked at Eliza. "You told me the starting was the hard part." "It is," she said. "You've done it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Eliza," he said. She waited. "I think I owe you an apology." She was genuinely surprised. She didn't try to hide it. "What for?" she said. "For the way this arrangement was framed," he said. "I treated it like a business resolution. I treated you like a solution to a problem. I didn't ask whether—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not a man who gives apologies easily." "I know," she said. "I'm giving you one anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "I accepted the terms," she said. "I signed my own name. That was my choice." "It was your only reasonable option," he said. "That isn't the same thing as a choice." She looked at him. Something in her chest did a thing she had been carefully not allowing it to do for the past 3.5 weeks. "No," she said. "It isn't." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He went back to the study, and she heard the scratch of his pen a few minutes later, starting the letter. She had told him to start putting down the first word, and then the next. And she sat at the hall table and did not move for a long moment, holding something in her chest that she hadn't left room for when she packed her trunk. She hadn't left room for it because she hadn't thought she'd need it. She was beginning to think she might have miscalculated. The community supper was held on the last Friday of every month at the Calvary Church Hall, and Agnes informed Eliza on the Wednesday before it that Carter had not attended in 4 years. "Not since Catherine died," Eliza said. "Not since Catherine died," Agnes confirmed. Eliza thought about this. "Who usually represents the property?" "No one. He sends a donation and doesn't go. And the county takes note of that. The county talks about very little else at the actual supper," Agnes said dryly. Eliza went to Carter that evening and told him she intended to attend the community supper on Friday, and that she would appreciate his company, but that she understood if he preferred to send the donation and continue his current arrangement. He looked at her. "You're going either way," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "And you're telling me rather than asking me because you're not asking permission." "Correct." "But you'd like me there." A pause. "I think it would be useful for the property," she said carefully. "The workers' families attend. The magistrate attends. The people whose goodwill matters to how this land runs are going to be in that room, and a year from now, when we need support from the county for the mill permits, the fact that you attended once will matter." "That's a very logical argument," he said. "Thank you. It's also not the reason you actually want me there." She met his eyes, held them. "No," she said. "It isn't." He said nothing for a moment. "Friday," he said. 7 o'clock, she said. "I'll have the carriage brought round at 6:30, he said. And she nodded, and she walked out of the room, and she did not smile until she was halfway up the stairs alone, where no one could see it. They arrived at the Calvary Church Hall at 7 minutes past 7, and the effect on the assembled county was everything Agnes had predicted, and considerably more. Eliza felt it the moment they walked through the door, the small seismic shift of a room recalibrating. Heads turning, conversations pausing at mid-syllable. The particular charged quiet of people who had been talking about someone and have just watched that someone walk in. Carter felt it too. She could tell by the slight stiffening of his posture, the way his jaw set, the way his eyes moved across the room, with the careful precision of a man who had grown up knowing that other people's regard was a thing to be managed, not received. She did something then that she hadn't planned. She put her hand on his arm, not clinging, not dependent, just present. Just a hand on his sleeve lightly, the way you'd steady something that didn't need steadying, but that you didn't want to let go of your hold on anyway. He looked down at her hand. He looked at her. He didn't pull away. "Ready," she said quietly. "No," he said just as quietly. "Good," she said. "Neither am I. Let's go anyway." And they walked into the room together, and the county watched, and Eliza smiled at the first person who made eye contact, and said good evening, and held her ground, and Carter stood beside her, and said nothing, and didn't leave, and that she thought was more than enough for one Friday night. It was in its own way the bravest thing either of them had done since the morning she signed her name on a piece of paper and walked out of her father's house and into a life she hadn't chosen, carrying everything she was toward a future that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. Show more. The supper at Calvary Church Hall did what small county gatherings always did. It talked. By Monday morning, Eliza knew it had talked, because Agnes came in from the market with her basket and her expression, and set both down on the kitchen table with the air of a woman delivering a report. "Well," Agnes said. "Well," Eliza said. "Mrs. Stokes told anyone who'd listen that you dragged him there against his will." That's one interpretation. Mrs. Delacroix told anyone who'd listen that you walked in like you'd been doing it for 20 years, and Carter looked like a man who'd just remembered how to stand up straight. Agnes began unpacking the basket. "I prefer Mrs. Delacroix's version." "So do I," Eliza said. "What else?" Orson Webb apparently told 3 men at the mill that Carter shook hands with people he hasn't spoken to since Catherine's funeral. Agnes set a jar down with precision. "And that you introduced yourself to every family from the South End who was in that room, and you knew all their children's names." "I'd met most of them already." "That's not the point." Agnes looked at her. "The point is that this county has spent 4 years watching that man close himself off like a house before a storm, and you've been here 5 weeks, and he went to the supper." She paused. "People are paying attention, Mrs. Carter." "People always pay attention," Eliza said. "The question is what they're looking for." She went back to her correspondence and didn't say anything else, but she kept what Agnes had told her and turned it over in a private corner of her mind, where she kept things that mattered but weren't ready to be examined directly yet. 5 weeks. 5 weeks since she had signed her name on a contract in her father's parlor and walked out into a life she hadn't chosen. In those 5 weeks, she had recovered a 6-year theft, rebuilt 3 cabin roofs, replaced a poisoned well. Started teaching children, their letters confronted a dishonest steward in a yard, and a cruel woman in a trading post, and a room full of strangers in a church hall, and sat across a supper table from a man who was learning slowly, and at considerable personal cost, how to be in the same room with another person without treating it like a defensive position. It was, she thought, a fairly productive 5 weeks. What she was less certain about was what was happening in the part of her that wasn't being productive. The part that had noticed at the community supper that when she put her hand on Carter's arm, he had not pulled away, and that when the evening was over and they were back in the carriage going home, he had sat closer to her than was strictly necessary given the available space, and neither of them had acknowledged it, and the silence between them for those 3 miles home had been of a specific quality. She didn't have a word for yet. She was working on finding the word. She wasn't rushing it. Carter came to find her in the study on Tuesday morning, and his face was doing something she had learned to pay attention to, the particular controlled expression of a man who had information he wasn't certain how to deliver. "The solicitor sent word," he said. "The Atkins matter goes to formal hearing next month. He wants you to present the accounting evidence in person." Eliza looked up from the ledger. "In court. In the county courthouse, yes. The solicitor says the magistrate wants to hear the methodology explained by the person who developed it." He paused. He said it's unusual to have a woman present evidence in that context. Unusual, she repeated. He said it, not me. And you told him. Carter held her gaze. I told him that if he wanted the evidence explained accurately, he was going to hear it from you because you're the only person in this county who can explain it accurately, and that if the magistrate had concerns about the source, he was welcome to explain those concerns to me directly. Eliza set her pen down. You said that, she said. I said that. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. It's simply true. She nodded and picked her pen back up, because if she kept looking at him, she was going to have to acknowledge the thing she was still finding words for, and she wasn't ready. I'll need 3 days to prepare the presentation, she said. I'd like to walk through it with you beforehand. You know the county solicitor better than I do, and I want to anticipate his questions. 2 days from now, he said. After supper. After supper, she agreed. He was almost out of the door when she spoke. Mr. Carter? He stopped. The solicitor, she said. Did he actually say he had concerns about the source? A pause. He implied it, Carter said. I didn't give him time to say it directly. She looked at her ledger. Good, she said. He left and she allowed herself one moment, just one of something that felt remarkably like warmth, and then she put it away and went back to work. 2 days later, they sat across from each other after supper with her presentation laid out between them, and Carter asked her questions for an hour and a half with the same focused, testing precision he'd brought to the operational recommendations, and twice she caught him almost smiling when she anticipated a line of questioning and answered it before he'd finished asking. She was presenting a chain of evidence. He was playing the skeptical magistrate. It should have felt like a rehearsal. It felt instead like two people who had found a shared language and were discovering how far it could carry them. He'll push on the altered agreements, Carter said. He'll ask whether there's any possibility the originals were misdated rather than tampered with. I have the paper provenance, she said. The ink on the alterations is different from the ink on the originals, visibly different under examination. I have 3 witnesses who can speak to the original terms as they understood them when they signed. Who are the witnesses? Tom Greer, Martha Abbott, and James Finch. She looked at him. All 3 have been on this property for more than 7 years. All 3 signed work agreements that Atkins altered. All 3 can read well enough to recognize that what they signed and what's in the record are not the same document. Carter was quiet for a moment. James Finch, he said. He was hesitant at first, she said. He wasn't certain a court would take his word over Atkins's. I told him that was exactly why we needed the paper evidence. His word wasn't going to be the only thing standing between him and Atkins. The numbers would stand with him. He agreed after that. He agreed after I showed him the side-by-side comparison and explained what it meant. She paused. He's a careful man. He needed to understand what he was committing to before he committed. I respect that. Something moved through Carter's face. Something she was becoming more practiced at reading, this specific quality of attention he brought to moments when she said something that required him to revise a previous conclusion. You went to him yourself, Carter said. Yes. You didn't send Agnes or ask me to speak to him. It wasn't my place to send someone else to ask a man for something that difficult, she said. If I was asking him to stand up in a courthouse, I should ask him myself. Carter looked at her for a long moment. You understand, he said slowly, that half the county's landowners have never shaken James Finch's hand. I'm aware, she said. I think that says considerably more about the landowners than about Mr. Finch. The silence after that was the charged kind, the kind that had something in it, and Carter reached for his glass of water and drank from it in the deliberate way he did things when he was deciding something. He'll testify, Carter said. Yes, Eliza said. He will. Carter set the glass down. You're going to win this case, Eliza. It was the second time he'd used her name. She felt it the same way she'd felt the first time, a small, precise thing landing quietly in the center of her chest. We're going to win this case, she said. Your property, your workers, your name on the documentation. Your work he said. Our outcome, she said firmly. That's how I'd prefer to think of it. He looked at her across the papers spread between them. How do you prefer to think of a great many things? He said. And it wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite anything else, and the room was very quiet. I've had to, she said. I've been adapting most of my preferences to new circumstances lately. As have I, he said. They looked at each other. Then he began gathering the papers into order, and she helped him, and their hands passed documents back and forth across the table with the practiced ease of two people who had been doing this long enough that they'd stopped being careful about it, and the evening folded in around them without either of them reaching for it. The crisis came on a Thursday. Not the Atkins hearing that was still 2 weeks out. A different crisis, the kind that didn't send letters in advance. It started with a rider coming hard up the road from town at mid-morning, and it ended with Eliza standing in the main hall with a letter in her hand and Carter standing across from her watching her face. Her father, Gerald Hartwell, had been taken ill. Not gravely, the letter was from the family physician, and it said serious but stable, said bed rest and concern. But not the language of emergencies. But her mother had written a separate line at the bottom, in her own hand, cramped and slightly desperate. Eliza, I would not ask if I did not need you. She read it twice. She looked up. Carter had not moved. Your father, he said. My mother needs me, she said. My father is ill, not critically, but she's asking me to come. Then go, he said immediately. She looked at him. Take the good carriage, he said. I'll have it readied within the hour. Take Agnes if you want company on the road. The hearing is 2 weeks away. You'll be back. The south cabin repairs aren't finished. I know where to find the timber order, he said. I have eyes, Eliza. I can manage the property for a few days. She looked at the letter in her hand. She had not been back to her father's house since the morning she left it. She had not seen her sisters or her mother or the room she had grown up in and learned to love and learned to see clearly and ultimately walked out of. I'll leave after noon, she said. I'll have the carriage at the door at 1 o'clock, he said. She nodded. She started for the stairs. Eliza. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she still sometimes caught him wearing when he thought she wasn't watching the one that had stopped being careful recently in a way she hadn't told him she'd noticed. Your mother asked for you, he said. Not for a message, not for money. For you. He held her gaze. That's not nothing. She held that. No, she said. It isn't. She went upstairs to pack. The Hartwell house was smaller than she remembered. She noticed it the moment the carriage turned up the drive, not smaller in its measurements, which hadn't changed but smaller in the way that all the places of your childhood become smaller when you've been somewhere else long enough to acquire a different scale of things. Her mother met her at the door. Margaret Hartwell, 52 years old, a woman who had spent her entire adult life managing on less than she'd been given and pretending it was abundance, who had the particular tiredness of women who did not rest because resting required you to stop holding everything up. She took one look at Eliza and pulled her close without a word, and Eliza held her for a long moment and didn't say anything either, because some things were better carried in silence. He's resting, her mother said when she stepped back. He was asking for you this morning. I'll go up, Eliza said. Ruth was at the top of the stairs, 16 years old, her sister 16, and trying very hard to be steady in the way she had learned from watching Eliza be steady, which was both flattering and slightly heartbreaking. She hugged Eliza hard and didn't cry, and Eliza recognized the effort it took and said quietly in her ear, You know. I won't tell anyone. Ruth laughed, which turned into something that wasn't quite laughing, and Eliza held her until it passed. Gerald Hartwell was in his bed and looked like a man who had been reduced by something, not just the illness, but by the preceding months, by the weight of what he'd done, and the knowledge that the consequences of it were now being lived out by the daughter he'd handed over to pay a debt. He was still recognizably her father, but he was thinner, older. Eliza, he said. Papa. She sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at her for a long time. His hands resting on the coverlet were the hands of a man who didn't know what to do with them. "You look well," he said finally. "I am well. The Carter property is managed," she said. "You don't need to concern yourself with that." He was quiet. "He treats you fairly," he said. The question cost him something. She could see it in the way he held himself around it carefully, like a man reaching for something he was afraid of dropping. "He does," she said. "I didn't know what else to do," he said. "I want you to understand that Papa." She said it quietly. "I understand what happened. I've understood it from the beginning." She held his gaze. "What I needed was for you to protect Ruth and Mama. You did that. We don't need to keep explaining it to each other." He closed his eyes for a moment. "You're too good to me," he said. "I'm honest with you," she said. "That's not the same thing as good." She reached over and straightened the coverlet where it had gone crooked at the edge. "Rest now. I'll be downstairs." She stayed 4 days. In those 4 days, she audited the remaining Hartwell accounts, not because Gerald had asked, but because she could see the ledgers going wrong from across the room, and she could not leave a solvable problem unsolved. Reorganized the household supply system, had a long conversation with her sister Ruth about what Ruth wanted to do with her life, that had nothing to do with finding a husband, and spent 2 evenings sitting with her mother on the back porch in the summer dark, talking about nothing important, and everything that mattered. On the 4th evening, her mother said, "Tell me about him." Eliza looked at the dark yard. "He's a careful man," she said. "He thinks before he speaks. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She paused. "He's been alone for a long time. He built something very solid and very empty, and he's been living in it." "And now," her mother said. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Now he's learning to open the doors," she said. Her mother was quiet. "Do you think you can be happy?" she said. Eliza thought about it honestly. She had been thinking about it honestly for 5 weeks, and the answer kept being more complicated than yes or no. "I think I already am," she said, "in ways I didn't expect." Her mother reached over and took her hand in the dark. Neither of them said anything else. She came back to the Eastern property on a Sunday, and Carter was in the yard when the carriage came up the drive. She noticed that immediately that he was in the yard, not in the barn, or the fields, or the study, the places where she could usually locate him by time of day with reasonable accuracy. He was in the yard, and he looked up when the carriage came through the gate, and something in his posture changed in a way that he probably didn't know was visible. She stepped down from the carriage. "How is your father?" he said. "Better," she said. "He'll need rest for several weeks, but the physician is less worried now." "Good." He looked at her. "Your sisters?" "Ruth is well. She's reading a book I left her about agricultural economics. She's furious that she finds it interesting." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Agnes made supper," he said. "It's been keeping warm." She was suddenly aware that she had not eaten since morning, and that the road was 3 hours long, and that there was something disproportionately moving about the phrase, "It's been keeping warm." "Thank you," she said. "The south cabin repairs were finished Wednesday," he said. "The timber came in Tuesday morning, and I had Marsh's crew start the same afternoon." He paused. "I found a discrepancy in the mill ledger while you were gone. I marked the pages." She looked at him. "You marked pages," she said. "I've been reconsidering my methods," he said. "You mentioned it might be more efficient." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been alone for 6 years, and careful for longer than that, who had marked pages in a ledger, and had supper kept warm, and was standing in the yard on a Sunday evening in a way that suggested he had been watching for a carriage. "Show me after supper," she said. "Yes," he said. "All right." And they went inside together, and the doors on the east wing were open, and the house felt for the first time since she had arrived in it like a place that was breathing. The morning of the Atkins hearing, Eliza came downstairs to find a box on the hall table. Not a large box. Plain wood, no wrapping. Her name on a folded card in Carter's handwriting, not Mrs. Carter, which was what he usually wrote on documents. Just Eliza. She opened it. Inside was a pen. Not an ordinary pen. A fine one. Horn-handled, balanced, the kind made by craftsmen, who understood that a person who works with instruments all day deserves an instrument made for her hand. There was a small card beneath it. You said you prefer to think of outcomes as shared. This is a shared outcome. It required someone who knew how to find what was hidden. NC. She stood in the hall for a moment. She closed the box. She put it in her bag. She was composed when Carter came downstairs 10 minutes later, dressed for the courthouse in his good coat, looking like a man who was braced for something difficult. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They rode to the courthouse together, and she did not mention the box, and he did not ask, and between them in the carriage was the specific charged quiet of two people who have said something to each other without using words and are both deciding how long to let it sit before they answer. Chatamang. The courthouse hearing lasted 4 hours. Eliza presented the evidence for 2 of them. She had expected resistance from the magistrate, from the county solicitor, from the particular atmosphere of a room that was accustomed to seeing women enter it only as dependents, not as the person at the front with the documentation. She had prepared for it the same way she prepared for everything, by knowing the material so well that uncertainty had nowhere to land. The magistrate, a man named Horace Bellamy, who had been on the county bench for 30 years, and had the bearing of someone who had seen every kind of fraud and appreciated having it explained clearly, asked her 4 questions. She answered all 4 without hesitation and with specific page citations. He asked a 5th question. She told him that was an excellent point and produced a supplementary document she had prepared specifically because she had anticipated it. He looked at the document. He looked at her. He looked at Carter, who was sitting in the front row with his hands folded and an expression of absolute composure. "Where'd you find her?" Bellamy said. "She found me," Carter said. Bellamy almost smiled. "Ruling in favor of the complainant," he said. "Full restitution to be determined at sentencing. Atkins to be held pending." He looked at Eliza over his reading spectacles. "That was the clearest fraud documentation I have seen in 30 years on this bench, Mrs. Carter. Whoever taught you this work did a fine job." "I taught myself," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Well," he said, "you did it right." They were outside the courthouse in the afternoon light, and the county was walking past them on the road, some of them looking, some of them deliberately not looking, and Carter was standing beside her, and he had not moved away. "You were magnificent," he said. She turned to look at him. He was not a man who used words like magnificent easily. She was fairly certain he had never used it before in her presence, and possibly not in years, and the fact that it had come out of him, without apparent calculation, told her something important about the state of things. "The documentation was sound," she said. "The documentation was sound because you built it," he said. "Don't redirect the credit." She looked at him. "You're learning my methods," she said. "I've been paying attention," he said. "Someone told me it was useful." She almost laughed. She came very close. She held it in but barely. "Take me home," she said. Something crossed his face at the word just briefly, just for a moment home, like a man who had heard a word he'd forgotten the weight of and was feeling it settle back into place. "Yes," he said. "All right." They walked to the carriage together, and his hand found the small of her back for just a moment as she stepped up. Not possessive, not practiced. Just present, just there. The way you reach for something without deciding to. And then it was gone, and neither of them spoke about it, and the carriage moved out onto the road toward the eastern property, toward the open doors and the repaired cabins, and the new well, and the children learning their letters, and all the slow, solid, real things she had built in 6 weeks, inside a life she hadn't chosen. She was choosing it now. She thought he probably knew that. She thought she was going to have to decide soon whether to say it out loud or let it keep being said in all the other ways they had gotten good at saying things without words. The carriage hit a rut in the road, and she slid 2 inches toward him on the seat, and he shifted to accommodate it and did not move back, and neither did she, and that was its own kind of answer. She looked out the window at the Virginia countryside rolling past in the late afternoon gold of an August day in 1818. And she thought about a woman who had walked into a contract negotiation and demanded her terms in writing. And she thought about a man who marked pages and kept supper warm and stood in a yard on a Sunday evening watching for a carriage, and she thought that sometimes the life you didn't choose turns out to have been waiting for you to find it all along. The road home ran straight and long ahead of them. She didn't look away from it. The ride home from the courthouse was 3 hours, and they spent the first hour in silence that was different from every silence they had shared before. Not uncomfortable. Not managed. The kind of silence that happens when two people have just done something together that mattered, and are still carrying the weight of it, not wanting to put it down yet, not certain what to say about it while they're still holding it. Carter spoke first, somewhere past the first mile marker. "Bellamy asked me afterward," he said, "while you were speaking with the solicitor. Asked you what? How long you'd been working the accounts." He paused. "I told him 8 weeks. He said it felt like the work of someone who'd spent 20 years doing it." Another pause. "I told him you'd spent 20 years watching other people do it badly, which was apparently better training." Eliza looked at the road ahead through the carriage window. "You said that," she said. "It's true. You're getting faster at saying true things out loud." "You're a poor influence," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the road. But there was something at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, because she had come to understand that a full smile from Nathaniel Carter was a rare and serious thing deployed sparingly, and therefore worth considerably more than the freely given kind. But close. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. "It was one," he said. The carriage rolled on. The afternoon light changed around them as the trees thickened on either side of the road, and the air coming through the window was cooler than it had been in weeks, carrying something that wasn't quite autumn yet, but was thinking about it. "The solicitor wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on another matter," Carter said. She looked at him. "At a different property dispute," he said. "Family in the next county estate, mismanagement. He says the family has been trying to untangle it for 2 years and getting nowhere." He kept his eyes on the road. "He asked if I thought you'd be interested. I told him that was entirely your decision, and he should direct the inquiry to you directly." She was quiet for a moment. "You told him to direct it to me," she said. "Not through you." "It's your work," he said. "Not mine." She turned back to the window. There it was again, that thing in her chest. The thing she had been finding words for since the evening in the study, when he had apologized and meant it. It was getting harder to not name. It was getting harder to hold at a careful distance and call it something practical like respect or professional regard. She knew what it was. She had known for a while. She just wasn't certain yet what to do with the knowing. "Tell the solicitor yes," she said. "I'd like to hear about the case." "I'll send word tomorrow," he said. They settled back into silence. 2 inches of seat between them. The Virginia road unrolling ahead. The eastern property waiting at the end of it with its open doors and its repaired roofs, and its children learning their letters, and all the life she had put back into it. She thought about something Agnes had said to her that first week, "You're going to be all right here." She thought that Agnes had probably understood before either of them did. The letter from Philadelphia arrived the following Monday, and it changed everything. Not Carter's letter he had written to Catherine's mother the week before, a measured, careful 3 paragraphs that he had read aloud to Eliza at the supper table, in a voice that was steady except once, and she had listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she had said it was right, and he had folded it and sent it the next morning, and had not spoken about it since. This letter was different. This one came addressed to Nathaniel Carter from a firm of Philadelphia solicitors, Graves and Whitmore attorneys at law. and it arrived with a second sealed envelope inside it, addressed in a handwriting that Carter recognized before he opened the outer letter. Because he went still in a way Eliza had only seen him go still once before the day he had held Catherine's mother's letter in the hall. She was at the breakfast table when he came in with it. She saw his face and put her coffee down. "What is it?" she said. He sat down across from her. He placed the outer letter on the table and looked at it for a moment, like a man deciding whether to open a door he wasn't sure he wanted to go through. Then he looked at her. "My father," he said. "He died 8 months ago. I didn't know." She didn't speak. We hadn't spoken in 11 years. He turned the letter over. He changed his will 6 months before he died. The solicitors have been trying to locate me. He paused. He left me everything. The silence held. "Everything," she said carefully. "The Philadelphia properties, the trade investments, the estate in Maryland." He set the inner envelope on the table between them. Graves and Whitmore estimate the total value at somewhere between 4 and 6 times what this property is worth. Eliza looked at the envelope. She thought about what that meant, not for the land, not for the accounts, but for him. A man who had spent 11 years building his own fortune out of sheer will and careful management, and the refusal to need anyone who had built walls tall enough that even grief couldn't get in. Who was just now slowly, painfully, one unlocked door at a time, learning to live in an open house again. And his father, who he had not spoken to in 11 years, had left him everything. "Did you know he'd changed the will?" she said. "No." His voice was careful. "We didn't speak. I didn't know he was ill." He put his hand flat on the table, a steadying gesture, a man pressing himself to the ground. "I didn't know he died. Nathaniel." She used his given name without deciding to. It was the first time. He looked up. She held his gaze. "Whatever you're about to do with that," she said, nodding at the envelope. "You don't have to do it right now. It will still be there in an hour. Or tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. "We weren't close," he said. "He was a hard man, demanding. He had opinions about every choice I made, and he shared them without being asked." A pause. "When Catherine died, he wrote me a letter. I wrote back and said things. He stopped. "We didn't speak after that." "What did he write to you?" she said. Carter was quiet for a moment. "He said grief was not an excuse to close yourself off from the people who needed you." His jaw tightened. "I told him he had never needed anyone in his life and therefore was not qualified to advise me on the subject." She absorbed that. "Were you wrong?" she said. He looked at her sharply. Then the sharpness faded and he was just tired. "Yes," he said. "I was." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the one that was pressed flat against the wood. Just her hand on the back of his. Just present. Just there. He looked down at it. He didn't pull away. "He changed the will 6 months before he died," she said quietly. "He was trying to reach you." "I know," he said. "He ran out of time." "I know." Something broke in his voice just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, and then he had it back. "I know that." They sat like that for a minute, maybe more. The morning going on around them, Agnes moving in the kitchen, the farmhands starting their day outside. The world conducting its ordinary business in the ordinary way of a Tuesday in September, entirely indifferent to the fact that a man was sitting at a breakfast table, coming to terms with something 11 years in the making. "What will you do?" she said at last. He turned his hand over under hers so they were palm to palm. It was the first time he had reached back. "I don't know yet," he said. "The Maryland estate will need to be managed. The Philadelphia investments, I'll need to understand them before I decide anything." He looked at their hands. "I'm going to need help." She said nothing. "I'm not good at asking for it," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I'm asking," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him across the breakfast table. This man who marked pages and kept supper warm, and had just held her hand without deciding to who was learning to open doors one at a time, and had just lost a father he hadn't spoken to in 11 years, and was choosing in the middle of that grief to reach toward someone rather than away. "I'm willing," she said. He closed his fingers around hers, and neither of them moved for a long time. The news traveled, because news always traveled, and within a week, the county knew that Carter's inheritance had changed the scale of things considerably. It changed the texture of how people approached him. The particular deference that money compels, in people who have been merely respectful before the additional warmth in handshakes. The way invitations appeared that had not appeared before. Eliza watched this with the clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything and discussed it with Carter directly one evening. "They want something from you now," she said. "They always wanted something goodwill, a favorable land ruling, a recommendation to the county board. But the scale has changed and so the wanting is louder." "I know," he said. "You need to decide what you actually want to do with it," she said. "The Maryland estate, the Philadelphia investments. Those are decisions, not obligations. You have options that you didn't have before." He looked at her. "What would you do?" She considered it seriously. "The Maryland estate should be inspected before any decisions are made," she said. "It may be well managed, or it may be another Atkins situation you won't know until someone looks at it properly." She paused. "The Philadelphia investments depend on what they're in and who's managing them. I'd want to see the full accounting before I trusted anyone's summary. And if I asked you to go to Philadelphia and look at them..." She looked at him. "Philadelphia," she said. "It's a 3-day journey." "I know how far Philadelphia is." "I'd come with you," he said. "I have to meet with the solicitors in person regardless." He held her gaze. "And I'd rather go with someone who can read a balance sheet than go alone and have someone explain it to me slowly, as though I'd never seen numbers before." "You can read a balance sheet," she said. "Not the way you can," he said. It was simple, direct. Not flattery, he didn't do flattery, just fact. She thought about Philadelphia. 3 days there, 3 days back. The solicitors' offices. The investments. A city she had never seen, and had been curious about since she was 12 years old, reading her father's correspondence from business partners who described it in terms that made it sound like another world. "When?" she said. 2 weeks, he said, after the mill permit hearing. "I'll need to brief Agnes on the household accounts," she said, "and I want Tom Greer overseeing the South operations while we're gone. He's ready for it, and it'll do him good to know you trust him." "Done," he said. "And I want to stop at my parents' house on the way," she said. "My father's recovery is slower than the physician expected. I won't be away 3 weeks without seeing them." "Of course," he said without hesitation. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "Philadelphia." Something happened in his face, relief she thought, but something warmer than relief. Something that had been sitting behind his eyes for weeks and was edging carefully toward the light. "Good," he said. "That's good." The night before they were due to leave for Philadelphia, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay in her room in the main house, the room that had been a guest room, and was now hers, that she had slowly arranged to suit herself. Over the past 2 months, the books on the shelf and the correspondence box on the desk and the window she kept cracked because she liked the night air, and she stared at the ceiling and was honest with herself about what was happening. She was in love with her husband. She had been resisting the word for weeks because the word carried weight, and the weight had implications, and the implications required her to do something about them, and she was a practical woman who preferred not to act on incomplete information. But she was being honest, and honesty required calling things what they were. She was in love with Nathaniel Carter, not because he was wealthy. She had known he was wealthy before she signed the contract, and it had been largely irrelevant to her since. Not because he had been kind to her exactly, though he had been increasingly in the specific understated way that was his, the marked pages and the kept supper and the pen in the box, and the hand turned over under hers at the breakfast table. Because he was real. Because he was trying. Because he had looked at grief and damage and the particular horror of losing someone you loved, and had built his defenses so high and so solid that nothing could get in. And then she had walked into his house and started opening the doors, and instead of throwing her out, he had slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of difficulty and occasional retreating, started helping her open them. Because he asked her what she wanted and listened to the answer. Because he had said, "I'm asking when he needed help," and she understood what it cost him. Because when she put her hand on his arm in the church hall and said, "Let's go anyway," he had gone. She knew what she felt. She didn't know what he felt, or rather she had evidence, significant and accumulating evidence, that what he felt was not nothing. But evidence was not certainty, and she had spent 2 months being careful, and she was tired of careful. She was going to say something. Not tonight. Not in the morning with the carriages and the luggage and the logistics of a 3-day journey. But in Philadelphia, or on the road there, or on the road back at some point in the next 2 weeks, she was going to stop filing it away and start saying it. She closed her eyes. She thought about a woman who had read a contract in her father's parlor and demanded her terms in writing, who had never once let anyone decide what she was worth when she was perfectly capable of determining that herself. She could tell a man she loved him. That was not the hardest thing she'd done this year. Not even close. They stopped at the Hartwell house on the second day of travel, and Carter came inside with her, which she had not specifically asked him to do, but which she discovered when he did it meant more than she had anticipated. Gerald Hartwell had been out of bed for a week, and was sitting in the front parlor with the careful posture of a man still proving to himself that he could manage it. He looked up when Carter came in behind Eliza, and something moved through his face, a complicated thing. Guilt and gratitude, and the particular discomfort of a man who had handed his daughter over as a debt payment and is now sitting across from the man he handed her to, trying to take the measure of how that has gone. Carter looked at Gerald Hartwell for a moment. Then he crossed the room and shook the man's hand. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "I'm glad to hear you're recovering." Gerald shook his hand, and he looked like a man who had not expected that, and who was undone by not expecting it. "Mr. Carter," he said. "Yes. Thank you for... yes." Carter sat down. He stayed for an hour. He talked to Gerald Hartwell about the tobacco market and the county road situation and the mill permit process with the easy conversational precision of a man who was making another man feel like a person rather than a problem. And Eliza watched from across the room and thought that this was what it looked like when someone who had learned to be selfish with their warmth decided to be generous with it. Her mother found her in the kitchen while the men talked. "He came in," her mother said. "He did." Margaret Hartwell looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who knows something important and is waiting to find out if the person in front of her knows it too. "Eliza," she said. "Mama. You love him." It was not a question. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. Her mother reached out and touched her face, the briefest, most specific gesture of a woman who had worried for months about whether the choice she had watched her daughter make was going to be survivable. "Good," she said softly. "Now tell him." They were a day out of Philadelphia when it happened. The carriage had stopped to rest the horses, and Carter had gotten out to walk for a few minutes, which he did when he'd been sitting too long. She had learned his habits, the way you learn the habits of someone you shared a life with without cataloging them, just by being present. She got out too, and they walked a stretch of road in the late afternoon, with the Virginia countryside going gold around them, and it was the kind of moment that didn't announce itself. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "You're always thinking." "Usually about accounts," she said. "This is different." He looked at her. "Different how?" he said. She stopped walking. He stopped. She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him across her father's parlor on the day they met, the day she had read a contract and refused to be reduced to a line item, the day she had walked into a life she didn't choose, and started making it into something she could live in. "I need to say something," she said. "And I'd like you to let me say all of it before you respond." He was very still. "All right," I came to your property as a settlement, she said. I knew what that was, and I knew what I was doing, and I'd make the same choice again because it was the right choice for my family. That hasn't changed. She held his gaze. What has changed is everything else. She paused. I am not operating under any illusion about how this started. I'm not asking you to retroactively make it something it wasn't. I'm telling you what it has become, at least from where I'm standing, because I've spent 2 months not saying it, and I am tired of not saying it. Carter hadn't moved. I love you, she said. Not the arrangement, not the property, or what we've built there, or the work we do together, though I value all of those things considerably. You. The person who marks pages and writes letters he's been afraid to write, and stands in a yard on a Sunday evening waiting for a carriage to come up the drive. She held steady. I'm not asking you to feel the same. I'm not making a demand. I'm just telling you the truth because I've always found honesty more useful than silence, and I've been silent about this long enough. She stopped. She waited. Carter looked at her for a long moment, the longest of all the long looks he had given her, and there had been many, but this one was different because his face was open in a way she had never seen it. No wall-up, no management happening, just him. The actual man beneath the careful architecture of protection he had spent 6 years constructing. Eliza, he said. Yes, I have been in love with you, he said slowly. Since the morning you walked into the barn and told me the south well was contaminated and the cabin roofs needed real repair, and your voice didn't shake once. He paused. I have been trying very hard not to be, because trying not to be felt safer, and I have been living in safe for a long time. She held very still. I am not good at this, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not. I don't have practice at it anymore, and the last time I had practice at it, I lost her, and I spent 6 years deciding that the solution to that was to not have anyone to lose. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has stopped managing what shows on his face. You walked in and made that impossible. You made it impossible in about 9 days, which I consider extremely inconvenient. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It came out before she could contain it, genuine and bright and startled, and it changed the air between them completely. He looked at her when she laughed, and the corner of his mouth moved, and then it wasn't just the corner. It was real. A full, actual, unmanaged smile, the kind she had been waiting for, the kind that was worth considerably more for being rare. I'm going to get better at it, he said. If you'll have patience with me. I'm not patient, she said, still catching her breath. I'm thorough. Then be thorough with me, he said. She looked at him. She stepped forward. She put her hand against his jaw, just her hand on his face, the way you touch something you've been careful not to touch for a long time, and are finally allowing yourself. I have been thorough, she said. From the beginning, that's how I know. He covered her hand with his. They stood in the middle of a Virginia road in the last gold of an August afternoon, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying that wasn't already being said in every other way. Philadelphia was everything she had imagined, and several things she hadn't. She had imagined the scale of it, the density, the noise, the particular energy of a city that was busy being the center of something important. She hadn't imagined how much she would want to see everything at once, and how little time there would be given, that they had actual business to conduct, and the Graves and Whitmore offices were waiting. The solicitors were a revelation in their own right. Graves was elderly and sharp. Whitmore was younger and quick, and he looked at Eliza across the conference table on the first morning with the expression of a man who has been expecting to present financial information to a landowner and has discovered that the landowner has brought someone who actually wants to see the original documentation. These are the investment summaries, Whitmore said, placing the folders in front of Carter. May I? Eliza said. Whitmore blinked. She has better instincts with this than I do, Carter said. Show her. Whitmore showed her. 2 hours later, she had found 3 discrepancies in the Philadelphia estate management that the solicitors had not flagged. one of which was minor, one of which was significant, and one of which she described to Whitmore as a creative interpretation of fiduciary duty that I expect the senior partners would prefer to resolve quietly. Whitmore stared at her. "Where were you 6 months ago?" he said. "Virginia," she said, "replacing a well and auditing a fraudulent steward." "Can we hire you?" he said. "No," Carter said from across the table pleasantly but with finality. "She's occupied." Whitmore looked at Carter, looked at Eliza, looked at the folder she had annotated in 2 hours with more precision than his office had managed in 6 months. "Of course," he said. Eliza did not look at Carter, but she was smiling. She kept it to herself, but she kept it. They came home from Philadelphia on a Thursday, and the Eastern property received them the way a place receives people who have been away long enough to be missed, with the specific quiet satisfaction of things continuing in their absence and waiting to show them what had been kept. Tom Greer met the carriage at the gate. He had a list in his hand, which Eliza recognized as his own doing, because Tom had not been a list maker before she left, and was apparently one now, and she felt something warm and specific about that. "South Mill had a mechanical issue Tuesday," he said before either of them was fully out of the carriage. "Caleb Marsh came out and fixed it same day. Didn't cost what I expected. I got him down on the labor. The new grain allotment schedule worked out cleaner than the old one. The Henderson boy has learned his whole alphabet." He paused. "And Mrs. Pryor has been running the house like a military operation and doesn't want me to tell you she was worried about the travel." "I won't tell her you told me," Eliza said. "Appreciate it, ma'am." Tom looked at Carter. "Good to have you back, Mr. Carter." "Good to be back," Carter said, and he said it like he meant it, which he did. And Tom Greer heard it and stood a little straighter, the way a man stands when he's been trusted and has earned it and knows it. Eliza walked into the house and Agnes met her in the hall and looked her over in the thorough, unsentimental way she had, checking for evidence of the journey of Philadelphia, of whatever had shifted, because Agnes always knew when something had shifted, it was one of her more inconvenient qualities. Whatever she found in Eliza's face, it made her set down the dish towel she was carrying and say without preamble, "Well, about time." "Agnes," Eliza said. "I've been watching the two of you move around each other for 3 months," Agnes said. "I was beginning to think I'd have to say something." "You would not have said something." "I absolutely would have," Agnes said. "I have opinions and I'm not young enough to keep them to myself." She picked the dish towel back up. "Supper's at 7. Welcome home, Mrs. Carter." She went back to the kitchen. Eliza stood in the hall of the house that had been a transaction and had become somewhere in the long, honest work of the past months, a home with its open doors and its repaired roofs and its children learning to read and its books on the study shelves and the window in her room, that she kept cracked because she liked the night air and she breathed it in. She was home. She knew it the way you know things that have stopped being ideas and become facts. The county found out about Philadelphia the way the county found out about everything, through a combination of the solicitor's correspondence, the mill permit office, and Mrs. Delacroix at the trading post, who had an information network that would have impressed a general. What the county found out was that Carter's inheritance had tripled the scale of his holdings, that his wife had gone with him to the solicitor's offices and identified financial mismanagement that his own solicitors had missed, and that the senior partner at Graves and Whitmore had apparently written to the county magistrate directly to say that if he ever needed someone to audit a contested estate, he should contact Mrs. Carter. Eliza didn't know about that last part until Magistrate Bellamy told her himself at the October county board meeting, which she attended, because Carter was presenting the mill permit application, and she was presenting the supporting financial documentation. "Graves wrote to me," Bellamy said, in the particular dry tone of a man who found life more interesting than he usually admitted. "Said you found in 2 hours what his office had been sitting on for 6 months. The discrepancies weren't hidden," she said. "They just required someone to look at the right columns in the right order." "Mrs. Carter," Bellamy said, "I've been a county magistrate for 30 years. You would be astonished how rarely people look at the right columns." She almost smiled. "Perhaps not as astonished as you'd think," He studied her for a moment. There's an estate dispute that's been sitting in my court for 14 months. 3 families contested inheritance. No one can agree on the original intent of the documents. He paused. I don't suppose you'd be willing to look at the documentation. Send it to the house, she said. I'll tell you what I find. He nodded once with the satisfaction of a man who has just solved a problem that has been irritating him for over a year. Carter, who had been standing close enough to hear the whole exchange, said nothing until they were outside. You just agreed to consult for the county magistrate, he said. He has a legitimate problem and I can probably solve it, she said. That seems like a reasonable use of my time. You're going to become the person everyone in this county calls when they have a document problem, he said. I already am, she said. I'd rather do it formally than have people showing up at the house on Tuesdays. He looked at her with the expression she had come to love most, the one that was somewhere between exasperation and complete unguarded admiration that he had stopped trying to conceal sometime around Philadelphia. You're going to be very busy, he said. I'm always busy, she said. I prefer it. I know, he said, and the way he said it warm, certain like a man saying something he has known for a long time and is no longer afraid to say, landed in her chest the way it always did. She picked up her folder. The mill permit, she said. Are you ready? I've been ready for 20 minutes, he said. Then let's go, she said, and they walked into the county boardroom together, and the county watched, and nobody was surprised anymore, and that was its own kind of satisfaction. Bottom. The twist came in November, and it came from a direction Eliza had not been watching. She had been watching the right directions. The estate dispute Bellamy had sent over the Maryland property inspection she had scheduled for the spring. The county lending questions that 3 separate families had brought to her in the past month, the mill operations and the grain figures, and Tom Greer's increasingly impressive management of the South operations. She had been watching all of those. She had not been watching her father's remaining business partner. His name was Franklin Ames, and he had been Gerald Hartwell's silent partner in the warehouse operation for 12 years. And he had been, as far as Eliza had always understood, largely absent from the actual management of the business. She had met him twice at Christmas dinners when she was a girl, and had formed the impression of a man who smiled too widely and listened too carefully and said very little that meant anything. The letter arrived addressed to Nathaniel Carter. It was cordial. It was complimentary about Eliza's work, specifically about the Atkins case and the Philadelphia consulting and the growing reputation she had in the county. It expressed admiration. And then, in the 3rd paragraph, it made its actual point. Franklin Ames had been holding a private note against the Hartwell warehouse, not the one Carter had forgiven as part of the marriage arrangement, but a second one smaller, kept separate from the main accounts that Gerald had signed without telling his family. Ames now wanted to call it in. The amount was not significant by Carter's current scale, but it was significant by Gerald Hartwell's, and the note gave Ames the right to claim the warehouse property directly, the warehouse that her mother and sisters were living above. Eliza read the letter 3 times. Then she went to find Carter. He was in the barn. She came in and put the letter in his hand and stood back and watched his face as he read it. She watched the controlled expression go careful and then go hard in the specific way it went hard when he encountered something he considered a deliberate act of bad faith against someone he was protective of. He looked up. He waited, Carter said. Yes, she said. He waited until the Atkins case was finished and your Philadelphia inheritance was public knowledge. He wants you to pay him off. He's using my family as leverage. He's using you as leverage, Carter said. He knows the amount is trivial to me now. He's not coming for the money. He's coming to see if he can get something larger by making you ask for it. She had already understood this. She had been turning it over for the 20 minutes it had taken her to find Carter, and she had come to the same conclusion. What do you want to do? He said. She looked at him. I want to go to my father's house, she said. I want to look at the original note. I want to see exactly what Ames has and what he doesn't have. And if the note is legitimate, then we deal with it, she said. But I want to look at it first. Franklin Ames has been a silent partner for 12 years, and I have never once seen his signature on a document that was exactly what it claimed to be. Carter looked at her. "When do you want to leave?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early." "I'll have the carriage ready at 6, he said. "I need you to come with me," she said. Not because she couldn't manage it herself, because she wanted him there. Because they were doing this together now, all of it, and she was done pretending otherwise. "I know," he said. "I'm coming." Gerald Hartwell, when presented with the letter, went a particular shade that was not quite gray and not quite white, and Margaret Hartwell, who had been sitting beside him, took his hand and held it with the practicality of a woman who had been steadying this man for 30 years. "I didn't think he'd call it," Gerald said. "It was a private arrangement, a bridge loan he called it, 2 years, and then we'd settle." "When was it signed?" Eliza said. 1814. "Did you have legal counsel when you signed it?" "No, it was between friends." "Franklin Ames is not your friend," Eliza said. She kept her voice level. Getting angry at her father for this particular failure of judgment was a luxury she did not have time for. "Do you have the original copy?" Gerald rose slowly and went to the writing desk in the corner, the same desk where he had hidden the ledgers that a 14-year-old Eliza had taught herself to read, and produced a folder. He held it out to her. She took it to the table and opened it. Carter stood behind her left shoulder, not over her, beside her at a slight angle that gave her the table and the light and the space to work while still being present. She had noticed he had learned to do this over the months. He had learned where to stand. She read every word of the note. Then she read it again. Then she sat back and looked at the folder for a moment. "Papa," she said. "Yes." "This note has a witness signature." She looked up at him. "Who is James Cordell?" Gerald frowned. "Ames's clerk. He witnessed most of Ames's documents." "James Cordell died in 1815, Carter said from behind her shoulder. "I know because he owed money to a man I did business with, and the debt died with him, and my associate was furious about it for 6 months. Eliza looked at the witness signature. She looked at the date on the document. "This document is dated March 1814, she said. "James Cordell died in August 1815. She held up the folder so Carter could see the signature. "This signature is not from 1814. Carter looked at it. His jaw tightened. "The ink," he said. "The ink is different," she said. "Different from the rest of the document. Someone signed this after 1815 and backdated the witness to 1814, which is impossible because Cordell was dead." She set the folder down. "Franklin Ames forged the witness signature on this note, which means the note itself is at minimum questionable and at maximum entirely fraudulent." The room was very quiet. Gerald Hartwell stared at the folder. "He forged it," he said. It was barely a sound. "He added the witness signature after the fact," Eliza said. "Whether the underlying note was legitimate or was also fabricated, I can't determine that without more documentation. But a note with a forged witness signature cannot be enforced. Any county magistrate will throw it out." Carter spoke. "Bellamy will see it the same way." "Bellamy will see it faster than I did," Eliza said. "He'll recognize Cordell's name immediately." "What does Ames not know?" Carter said. She looked at him. "He doesn't know that we know Cordell is dead. He's been counting on my father not examining the document too carefully. He's been counting on the amount being small enough that you'd simply pay rather than look." "He doesn't know who he's dealing with," Carter said, and the way he said it, quiet, absolutely certain, was one of the best things she had ever heard. She closed the folder. "I'm going to take this to Bellamy," she said, "and then I'm going to write to Franklin Ames and inform him that his note has a forged witness signature and that we look forward to discussing it with him in court." Her father was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something past gratitude, something that was coming to terms with who his daughter was and what he had never quite understood about her until this moment. "Eliza," he said, "It's all right, Papa," she said. "This is what I do." The meeting with Franklin Ames happened 10 days later in the county magistrate's office because Bellamy had looked at the document for approximately 4 minutes before saying, with the calm of a man who has been lied to by professionals and finds amateurs somewhat tedious, that the forgery was evident and that Mr. Ames was welcome to explain himself or leave the county. Ames had not expected the forgery to be found. He had, in the way of men who underestimate women, expected Eliza to either not look at the document carefully or not know what she was looking at if she did. He had been counting on a young wife deferring to her husband who might pay up rather than create a scene. He had not accounted for the possibility that the young wife had built a reputation with the county magistrate for precisely this kind of work, or that she would walk into his office with a marked folder and 3 minutes of argument that had Bellamy nodding before she finished the second point. Ames walked out of the magistrate's office with no note, no claim, and a formal finding on record that the witness signature was fraudulent. Bellamy had referred the matter to the county solicitor for further review of Ames's other business practices. Carter walked out of the same office and said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said, "You knew when you read the folder." "I suspected," she said. "The ink looked different. I didn't know about Cordell until you mentioned him, but you were already looking for it," he said. "Before I said anything about Cordell, you were already suspicious." "Franklin Ames smiles too much and listens too carefully," she said. "I've thought so since I was 9 years old. I just didn't have documentation until now." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He looked at her, the full open look, no wall, no management, just him. "My father's letter," he said, "the one in the Graves and Whitmore files. There was a line in it I didn't tell you about." She waited. "He wrote it 6 months before he died," Carter said. He said he hoped that someday I would find someone who argued with me." He paused. He said his greatest regret was that he'd spent his whole life being too careful, and that the best moments of his life were the ones where someone had the courage to be honest with him, even when it cost them something. He held her gaze. "He wrote that letter before I married you. He never knew you existed." She absorbed that. "He was describing you," Carter said, "before he knew you." She looked at him. "He was describing what he hoped for you," she said. "Yes," he said. And he was right. She reached up and took his hand where it was at his side, and held it, and they stood in the street outside the county magistrate's office, while the November county went about its business around them, and neither of them moved. Christmas came to the eastern property the way Christmas came to places that had been quiet and were learning to be full again, a little awkwardly at first, finding its footing, then with increasing confidence. Eliza had invited her family. All of them her parents Ruth, her younger sister Clara, who was 13, and had her mother's eyes and Eliza's way of watching a room before deciding what she thought of it. Gerald Hartwell came in a carriage assisted by 2 walking sticks and the remnants of his dignity, and he shook Carter's hand on the porch with the grip of a man trying to communicate something he didn't have the words for. And Carter shook back without making it into anything, which was the right thing to do. Agnes had been cooking for 3 days. Tom Greer brought his family from the South End. The Henderson children came, the ones who had learned their letters in Eliza's morning lessons. And the oldest one, a boy named Daniel, 9 years old, gap-toothed and serious, presented her with a paper on which he had written his full name in the careful block letters she had taught him, and the words, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." And she took it and folded it and put it in her pocket and did not cry, but it was a near thing. Ruth spent most of the afternoon following Carter around, asking him questions about the property management and the investment structure of the Philadelphia holdings, and Carter answered her with the same direct patience he had learned to use with everyone. And at some point Eliza caught Ruth looking at Carter. The way you look at someone you've decided you respect, and Carter looking back with the expression of a man who has recognized that capability in a young woman and is taking it seriously. "She's like you," he told Eliza later quietly. "She's better than me," Eliza said. "She's starting earlier." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean she's 13 and she already knows what questions to ask," she said. It took me until I was 14 to start reading the ledgers. She'll be reading them at 11 if someone hands her the key." She paused. "I'd like to send her books, regularly. From the Philadelphia Investment Library, there are accounting texts there that she'd read in a week." He didn't hesitate. "Done. And if she wants to come here in the summers," she said, "to learn the property management properly, I'd like that. She needs somewhere to put what she knows." "She's welcome here whenever she wants to come," he said. "This is your house, Eliza. The people you want in it are welcome in it." She looked at him. "Your house. Not my house. Not our house, though, that would come and had been coming for months, in the slow, real way that things between them moved without announcement, just settling into truth. Your house." "Ours," she said. He held her gaze. "Ours," he agreed. 10. The letter came from Catherine's mother in January. It was addressed to both of them, Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Carter, in the slightly uneven handwriting of a woman whose hands gave her trouble, but who was going to write the letter anyway. It was 4 pages. Carter read it first alone in the study, and came to find Eliza in the hall, where she was working on the Bellamy estate documentation. He set the letter on the table in front of her. She looked at him. "Read it," he said. "Please." She picked it up and read it, all 4 pages. Catherine's mother. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and she was 68 years old and lived in Richmond, and had not left her house much since her daughter died, had written about Catherine. About who she had been. About the way she laughed, and the way she argued, and the way she had loved Nathaniel Carter, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided on something and was not going to be moved. She wrote about the grief of losing her, and she wrote about the years of silence, and she wrote without blame, only with the honesty of a woman who had run out of time to be anything but direct. And then she wrote about Eliza. Not by name at first. She wrote about what Carter had told her in his letter about the accounts about the South Well, about the children learning their letters about the hearing, and the Ames matter, and Philadelphia. She wrote about a woman she had never met, who had walked into a life she hadn't chosen, and built something real inside it. And then she wrote, "I think Catherine would have loved her. I think she would have been relieved. She worried in the last months that you would spend the rest of your life alone inside your own grief. She made me promise to keep writing to you, even if you didn't write back. I've kept that promise for 6 years, and I think, Mr. Carter, that you have finally kept yours to her, the one you made when you married her, which was to live well. You are living well. I can see it in every word you wrote to me." Eliza set the letter down. She was quiet for a long moment. "She's right," she said. Carter sat across from her. His face was open in the way it only was with her now, no management, no careful distance, just him. "I know," he said. "You should write back today," she said. "I already started," he said. "I wanted you to read the letter first." He paused. "She asked about you. By name in the last paragraph. She asked if she could write to you directly." Eliza looked at the letter. "I'd like that," she said. "I told her I thought you would," he said. She looked up at him. "You told her before you showed me the letter," she said. "I know what you'll want," he said simply. "I've been paying attention." She picked up the letter and folded it carefully along its original creases. "You've gotten very good at that," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. Spring came back to the eastern property, the way spring always came to Virginia, not gently, not gradually, but all at once with the particular urgency of a season that had been waiting and was no longer willing to. Tom Greer had the south fields planted by March. The mill was running at better than full capacity with 2 additional contracts Eliza had negotiated through the county board over the winter. The Bellamy estate dispute had been resolved in February. She had identified the original intent of the disputed documents through a combination of handwriting analysis, witness testimony, and a land survey record that nobody had thought to look at, and Bellamy had called it the cleanest resolution of a contested estate he had seen in his career, which was the kind of thing that traveled. By April, she had 3 consulting requests on her desk from counties she had never been to. She sat with them at the study table one evening and looked at them for a long time. Carter came in and looked over her shoulder at the letters. "How many?" he said. "3," she said. "One from Fauquier County, one from Spotsylvania, one from a family in Maryland who heard about the Ames matter through the Philadelphia solicitors. All legitimate estate and accounting disputes. As far as I can tell from the initial correspondence, yes." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the letters. "I want to say yes," she said. "To all 3. She paused. "I know that means travel. I know it means weeks away from the property, possibly more than once." She met his eyes. "I'm asking you what you think, Enid." "I think," he said, "that you built a system here that Tom Greer can run without daily oversight. I think Agnes can manage the house in her sleep and has been doing so periodically since the day you arrived. I think the Philadelphia investments are stable and the Maryland estate inspection is scheduled for May and can travel with us." He held her gaze. "And I think that a woman who taught herself accounting from a locked drawer and walked into a county courthouse and won a fraud case and identified a forged witness signature and resolved a 14-month estate dispute in 3 weeks should not be limiting herself to one county." She looked at him. "You want to come with me," she said. "I want to go where you go," he said. "I've found it suits me considerably better than staying behind." She thought about the carriage on the road to Philadelphia. She thought about 2 inches of seat and the specific quality of that silence. She thought about a man who stood in a yard on Sunday evenings and came in from the barn when she walked in from her father's house and covered her hand with his at a breakfast table when he was frightened and hadn't said so. "The Fauquier matter first," she said. "It's closest, and the letter suggests some urgency." "I'll write to them tomorrow," he said. "I'll need the file Agnes has on the county land records," she said. "Fauquier borders 3 other counties, and the dispute may cross lines." "I'll find it tonight," he said. She looked at the 3 letters on the table. Then she looked at him. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the letters, not for the logistics, for all of it. The whole long, improbable, real thing that had started with a contract in her father's parlor and had become, without either of them planning it, the life she would have chosen if she'd been given the choice." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Don't thank me," he said, and his voice was warm and steady in the way it was now when he wasn't managing what showed in it. "You did this. You walked into this house and opened every door you found, and I followed you through them. All I did was not get in your way." "You did considerably more than that," she said. "Then we're even," he said. She turned her hand over under his, the way he had done at the breakfast table in November, and held on. The eastern property in the summer of 1819 was not the same place it had been the summer before, and everyone who knew it knew why. The south cabins had solid roofs and clean water and children who could read. The mill had 2 new contracts and an efficiency rate that the county board had cited as an example at their spring meeting. Tom Greer was running the South operations with the confidence of a man who had been trusted and had proven the trust was warranted, and he was teaching his own son the figures the way Eliza had taught him. The county came to the eastern property differently than it had before, not deferentially, the way you approached a wealthy man's land, but with the particular ease of people who had learned that the door was open and someone inside would listen. Orson Webb came in March to ask about a boundary dispute with his neighbor, and Eliza sat with him at the kitchen table for an hour and explained his legal options and the county survey records and what she thought he should do. He left with a plan and without owing anyone anything, and he told 3 people, and those 3 people told others, and by April there were 2 people a week at the kitchen table. Agnes adapted to this with the resigned efficiency of a woman who had long since accepted that her household was not going to operate on conventional lines. Carter adapted to it by quietly expanding the kitchen table. Eliza noticed when the new table arrived. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a moment. It was twice the size of the old one. She went to find him. The table, she said. The old one was too small, he said. You had a larger table made. Within the week, he said. Agnes told me about the traffic. She looked at him. You didn't ask me, she said. It's your table, he said. I was fairly certain I knew what you'd want. She held his gaze for a moment. You were right, she said. I know, he said. She was almost past him in the hallway when she stopped and turned back. Nathaniel. He looked at her. She crossed back to him and kissed him. Not the careful, tentative thing that their first kiss had been back in Philadelphia, both of them finding the shape of it, but fully, with the ease of two people who have learned each other and are no longer afraid of what they know. He kissed her back the same way. When she stepped back, his hands were still at her waist. What was that for? He said. The table, she said. He looked at her with the full, unguarded smile, the real one, the rare one, the one worth waiting for. I'll order more furniture immediately, he said. She laughed and walked down the hall, and he watched her go, and the house around them was full of light through its open doors, and the sound of the morning starting up outside, and the particular, irreplaceable sound of a life that had chosen itself. The woman who had been handed over like a line item on a ledger had become the heart of everything that mattered on this land. The man who had spent 6 years building walls tall enough to keep out grief had opened his doors and found on the other side of them more than he had thought he was still capable of holding. They had not started with love. They had built it the way you built anything worth keeping, slowly, honestly, with both hands from the ground up, and without ever once pretending it was something other than what it was, and that it turned out made it stronger than anything either of them had ever known.